volume of capital more than 7 times new lending in the United States. It is the equivalent of an Obama stimulus package, that's $800 billion over 2 years, about every 29 days. Just as the United States meted out access to its market to bribe its way into the world's largest ever alliance, the Chinese used finance to bribe both its often conflicting regions and ever-restive populations into quiescence and even cooperation. It is a brilliant strategy, but it has limits. Japan followed a similar system in the 1950s through the 1980s, eventually reaching a level of overextension that brought the entire system to its knees. In the quarter century since the Japanese crash, the Japanese banking sector has retreated completely from the global system, and the Japanese economy as a whole has not grown. Such stagnation is China's best-case scenario future. Unfortunately, it is also not a very likely one. The Japanese economy is largely domestically held and demand-driven, so while loose credit certainly helps, it is not the hedge against doomsday that it is in China. Additionally, Japan is over 98% ethnically Japanese, and over 4/5 of the population lives on the island of Honshu. China is considerably less unified regionally, ethnically, and spatially. The United States even experimented with this system, the idea that growth and throughput were more important than profitability and a positive rate of return on capital. The result was a mess of graft, abuse, and unwise lending that created the failed company we knew as Enron, and the property bubble we now know as subprime. Both experiments created impressive growth for years, but such investments were geared to maximize throughput, not profits or efficiency. And so they collapsed. In essence, the entire Chinese system is subprime in every economic sector. Problem 2. Demography. But let's assume for a minute that China's remarkably unstable financial system holds together a bit longer. Something even worse is just around the corner. China's one-child policy is often held up as the pinnacle of what can happen when a government is willing to pair demographic concerns with a complete disregard for individual rights. In a few short years, strict enforcement slashed the birth rate, preventing an estimated 200 million to 400 million births and heading off the overpopulation problem that policymakers so feared. Now, the success of that policy means the end of the Chinese system. There are many legitimate criticisms of one child. Forced abortions, the ability to buy government approval to flaunt the policy, the concept that the government can choose who can reproduce when, a massive sex imbalance in a culture that prefers sons to daughters, all these and more have twisted Chinese culture in awkward and painful directions. But the real problem with one child is that it worked. During the period from 1979 to 2003, when it was strictly enforced, the birth rate dropped by half. That slashed everything from healthcare to education to food costs, but it gutted the most recent generation. After 3 decades of the policy, there has been a European-style hollowing out of the younger segments of the population. This presents China with 3 unavoidable and system-killing problems. First, China is aging far more quickly than it is getting rich. At the beginning of China's international resurgence in 1990, the average Chinese citizen was only 24.9 years old, and the country boasted some 350 million citizens aged 15 to 29. It was this simple circumstance that allowed for China's massive manufacturing boom in the 1990s and 2000s. China was the world's ultimate source of cheap labor, and no other developing country could compete with the Chinese on price. Fast forward to the present, and courtesy of one child, the average Chinese is now 37, just a shade younger than Americans who are currently 37.3 years old. The Chinese will pass the Americans in average age in 2019, and by 2030 will be 42.9 years old versus 39.6 for the Americans. The Chinese call it the 4-2-1 problem. 4 grandparents to 2 parents to 1 child. China is not yet wealthy enough to be able to try to afford a pension system like the advanced democracies, which places the onus of caring for the elderly on their descendants, of whom there are precious few. In terms of relative numbers, the financial cost of the one-child policy is more than double the comparative costs that the Americans face from the boomer retirement. and the Americans already have a social security system in place to absorb some of the cost. The burden of having to financially support their elderly has a catastrophic impact on young workers' professional and financial development, reducing educational opportunities, gutting consumption, and all but making savings impossible. In China's specific situation, not only will this factor alone freeze in place China's efforts to switch its economy from exports to internal consumption and stymie its efforts to move up the value-added scale, but it will also prevent the sort of savings that makes the force-fed finance model possible in the first place. Second, China will never be able to move away from its current export-driven model. Recall what roles each age group carries out in society from an economic point of view. Young workers do the consuming that generates economic growth. The last baby boom that China experienced was in the 1980s, just as one child was picking up. And China has suffered from an intentional baby bust ever since. Those boom babies are now aged 25 to 29 and are very visible as a bulge in China's population pyramid. It may be only a 5-year increment, but it represents about 125 million people. This group's consumption is the primary reason why China appears to be succeeding somewhat in its current efforts to switch from an export-led to a consumption-led economy. But again, courtesy of one child, their successors are ever smaller population cohorts. So congratulations are due to China for having impressive consumption growth in recent years. But that consumption growth has never beat out investment and loan-driven activity and is now nearly played out. Third, so too is the Chinese development model. Simple aging has already reduced China's pool of young, mobile workers by over 40 million during the last decade. And because of the baby bust, that decline is about to accelerate greatly. Put simply, China has run out of surplus labor. Its presence on the low-cost side of global manufacturing has run its course. This is already reflected in Chinese labor costs, which have sextupled since 2002. Looking forward just 25 years, China faces a far darker financial future than Europe and a far darker demographic future than Japan. I normally caution people I speak with about drawing forward linear trends. For example, the idea that China, or before it the Soviet Union or Japan, will soon rule the world. But demography is different. Young workers simply do not magically appear. They have to be born and raised. It takes 20 years to grow a 20-year-old. Well, 20 years and 9 months if you want to be exact. Changing a demography requires a broad-scale shifting of cultural and economic trends, and then holding the change for decades. Simply abolishing one child is only one step of the process. China would then need to encourage the young workers who are crammed into apartment housing to produce multiple children while still working and taking care of their parents and grandparents. It would have to build out an entirely new series of social services in health and childcare whose absence provided the spare capital that helped make China's manufacturing boom possible. Even if we assume that China can pull this off, and an immediate abolition of the one-child policy leads to an immediate doubling of birth rates, which would be unprecedented in human history, it would still be 2 decades before China would begin to benefit from an expansion of the labor pool in any significant manner. That's 2 decades during which the rest of the Chinese population would still be aging toward retirement. 2 decades during which China won't have much internal consumption going on. 2 decades during which the low-cost, export-led model would still not work. And of course, even if China could somehow survive that, it would still remain locked into a system whose very survival is simply beyond Beijing's control. The Bretton Woods network is what made everything about China. Its unification, its existence as a modern state, its manufacturing base, its export-led economy, its military strength, possible. There are any number of reasons how the Americans backing away from Bretton Woods would be disastrous for the Chinese. Here are 4. 1. As with many other countries in the Bretton Woods world, the Chinese have purposefully adjusted their system to maximize the role that exports play. So the largest and most dynamic portion of the Chinese economic system has been and remains export-driven. Roughly 10% of China's GDP depends upon direct exports to the United States. Using any Chinese statistics is an exercise in risk. The national government regularly reforms the country's local and regional statistical reporting systems so that it too can get a more accurate picture of the Chinese systems. Oftentimes, such auditing efforts run afoul of the interests of local politicos to such degree that the auditors die under